Welcome to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie. After learning a ton about kidney stones and helping people prevent stones at the University of Chicago, I was fed up with all the terrible advice people were finding online. So I decided to do something about it. The Kidney Dietitian was born. This podcast is for people who want to learn what actually works to prevent kidney stones and still enjoy life, eating, and their favorite foods. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the 116th episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. As always, I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie. And I wanted to dive into a very specific question that maybe not many of you have, but I think it's a really important question. And I've been getting more and more questions about it. And that is, does phosphorus, in terms of dietary phosphorus, so how much phosphorus you eat, does that matter if you have calcium phosphate kidney stones? It's a very obvious question to ask, right? Because we talk about calcium oxalate stones all the time. We talk about how much calcium you should eat and oxalate you should eat and like all these things, right? But what about phosphorus? That's really not part of the conversation very often, but calcium phosphate stones are one of the second most common types of stones. So I thought that I would dive into my thoughts on it. So if you aren't familiar with sort of stone prevalence and what types of stones most of us have, by and large, most of us are definitely forming calcium oxalate stones. Somewhere between like 75 to 80-ish% of kidney stones are made of calcium oxalate, which is why we talk about that all the time. But I really wanted to give some love to the many people I know that follow me that have calcium phosphate stones. So calcium phosphate stones are not as common, obviously. They make up somewhere between 7 to 10-ish% of kidney stones. So not super common, but definitely one of the second most common types of stones, since obviously calcium oxalate stones take up the lion's share of the types of stones. I also wanted to throw out there the words brushite and apatite. These are sort of types of calcium oxalate kidney stones. So if your doctor says that you have a brushite stone or apatite stone, or if you get your stone analysis back and it says either brushite or apatite, that's basically just saying that you have a calcium phosphate stone. They're just a sort of subtypes of calcium phosphate kidney stones. So, spoiler alert, I will say that generally dietary phosphorus is not really a target and doesn't really matter in the direct sense of the word when it comes to preventing calcium phosphate kidney stones. Although I do have a bit of a caveat, and I'll get to that later. Because really, actually, just like calcium oxalate stones, generally calcium phosphate stones are being caused because of high levels of calcium in your urine. It's not really high phosphorus that's really driving calcium phosphate kidney stone formation, right? It's really, for most people, tends to be that high urine calcium. But of course, we really need to look at your 24-hour urine test to really understand what's driving your stone formation, because certainly there's other risk factors. Potentially very low citrate could be in there, potentially very low volume. These tend to be, most people have one or maybe two of those risk factors. You don't generally have all of them. But again, it's not really high phosphorus that's driving that stone formation for calcium phosphate stones. It's not really increasing that risk of that stone that much. So I thought I would give a very high level of the research on this topic. And I think there honestly isn't a ton on it, because I think that some very large studies consistently have found that when you look at strictly how much phosphorus you eat, that does not correlate or is not associated with eating more stones. And I'll link to some of my favorite studies that show this below, of course. So when we simply look at, do people who eat more phosphorus form more stones, or vice versa? Do people who eat less phosphorus form less stones? And it doesn't really seem to be true. So I think that's kind of why we don't really talk about it very much. However, there were a couple studies that I found that when you look at the calcium phosphate ratio, when you have a lower calcium phosphate ratio, this does seem to be protective when it comes to kidney stones. And another study found that when you are, that we know that eating a ton of phosphorus, and I'll talk next about where phosphorus comes from and which phosphorus we might want to be concerned about, but when people eat a very high phosphorus load, we know that kind of messes with our our bone mineral metabolism, which directly impacts kidney stones, right? When we think bone mineral metabolism, we're thinking calcium and phosphorus, bones breaking down, and sort of the byproducts of that breakdown ending up in our urine. And we definitely know that eating a very high phosphorus diet isn't great for that sort of thing. And there's definitely hormonal changes and potentially bone risk and these types of things. But when you consume adequate calcium along with that high phosphorus intake, it seems to attenuate or lessen the negative impacts of that high phosphorus, if you will. So again, just kind of shedding nuance on this very complicated topic, and also showing you how important it is to really make sure that you're consuming enough calcium, no matter what type of calcium stone you have, whether you have calcium oxide or calcium phosphate stones. It's actually very important that you are consuming adequate calcium for a large number of reasons, but also very notably to help protect your bones. There was also another really interesting study that I'll link to that actually took a small group of people who did not have kidney stones, so small caveat there, but took them in sort of a research center and gave them a ton of phosphorus and then measured what happened in their urine. And basically they found that when people ate a lot of phosphorus, they did have higher urine phosphorus, which makes sense, but they also had higher levels of acid in your urine, which directly, I'm sure, impact their risk or supersaturation of uric acid stones, because uric acid stones are most driven by high levels of acid in your urine. And when we think about calcium phosphate stones, which is the topic of our podcast today, of course, this higher urine phos and higher acid really is a very complicated risk profile, because we have some good things and some potentially bad things going on. Because calcium phosphate stones form in alkali urine. That's one of the biggest drivers, if you will, of calcium phosphate stones. So calcium phosphate stones will not form in acidic urine. And so the fact that this high phosphorus load increased urine acid actually is protective potentially for calcium phosphate stones, despite the fact that it did actually have that the higher phosphate itself in your urine. So again, this is like a very convoluted, complicated topic, which really I think kind of shows that nuance and how like that's potentially why we don't see a very direct correlation with like eating more phosphorus equals more stones, like we do pretty consistently with things like eating more sodium equals more stones, eating more added sugar, eating more meat, and these types of things, right? We know that these things are associated with more kidney stones. And it absolutely makes sense, because we know that phosphorus is one of the acid-producing nutrients, primarily protein and phosphorus, which actually tend to come together in foods anyway. But if we're thinking about it from a strictly sort of chemistry standpoint, phosphorus, the metabolism of phosphorus produces acid. So it's not surprising that when we give someone a high phosphate load or a high phosphate diet, acid increases in their urine. That just makes sense. So moving on to a little bit more of a down-to-earth, tangible, action-oriented part of the podcast. What does this mean for the food on your plate? Does this matter at all? And I would say kind of, but let me kind of break it down. So the first question is, where does phosphorus come from anyway? I think in the chronic kidney disease world, we talk a ton about phosphorus, but we don't really so much in kidney stones. Primarily, as I've showed you, it's not really probably that big of a deal, but I do still think it's interesting. So let's dive into it. So phosphorus comes from all sorts of different sources. It comes from meat, it comes from dairy. Also, for the record, when I say meat, that also includes things like poultry, fish, seafood, any sort of animal protein is going to have a fair amount of phosphorus in it. So meat, dairy, and also there's plant sources. So whole grains have a fair amount of phosphorus in them, as well as beans, nuts, and seeds. However, the kicker is that there is a massive difference in how much phosphorus you actually absorb from these different food sources of phosphorus. So let me share what I mean here. So meat, the phosphorus in meat is going to get absorbed somewhere between 80 to 90-ish% of the phosphorus in meat is going to get absorbed. Dairy, probably somewhere between 70 to 80%. But when you compare that to plant sources of phosphorus, things like whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, only like 30-ish% of that phosphorus gets absorbed. And then when you think about the phosphorus that is added to sort of ultra-processed foods, unfortunately a lot of ultra-processed foods, so things like chips, commercial pre-made dinners, sauces, like all these ultra-processed foods, a lot of them actually have phosphorus added to them for a wide variety of reasons, to help preserve color, flavor, shelf life, these types of things. And the phosphorus that's added to processed foods is nearly 100% absorbed, right? So you've got sort of on the one end of the spectrum, 100% of the phosphorus, nearly 100% of the phosphorus from processed foods is getting absorbed. And similarly, you've got like 90-ish% from meat, 70-ish from dairy. But on the other side of the spectrum, you have just 30% of the phosphorus from whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds gets absorbed. So that's a huge, huge, huge difference. And that is why there's actually a huge push in the chronic kidney disease nutrition world to not, we used to say, hey, because people with chronic kidney disease cannot get rid of phosphate as effectively, and it when you have a high phosphate load, because they basically can't handle that messing with that bone metabolism, it can definitely cause harm. And so we used to say, hey, people with chronic kidney disease, stop eating all these, quote, high phosphate foods. And we listed things like whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, and now we do not list those things because we have a greater understanding that these foods actually, the phosphorus doesn't get absorbed from these foods, and these foods are actually good for your kidneys, including kidney stones and chronic kidney disease. So we don't ask people to limit those foods anymore. But transitioning back to kidney stones, even if we were concerned about phosphorus, if you just were like, you know what, Melanie, like this really makes me nervous, I have calcium phosphate stones, I don't want to eat phosphorus, then I would say, okay, well, let's think about the types of foods where we're getting most of our phosphorus from, where most of that more absorbable, more bioavailable phosphorus is coming from. And that's processed foods and meat, right? Dairy is the one caveat, because dairy is definitely stone protective, and the phosphorus in dairy is fairly highly absorbed. However, we know that eating more processed foods that generally contain most of the added sugar and sodium in our diet and meat is definitely associated with kidney stones in general, right? And so I think by that, when you think about it from that lens, it certainly makes sense to reduce the, quote, phosphorus that you're consuming. But it's probably, in reality, not really the phosphorus in those foods that's being protective for kidney stones. It's probably the fact that you're reducing your intake of very high acid producing foods, as well as added sugar and sodium and those types of things. Because that high acid load and that added sugar and added sodium can all directly impact those urine calcium levels, which, full circle, again, that is really what's driving most stone formation, whether we're talking about calcium phosphate or calcium oxalate kidney stones. Those things are associated with kidney stones for lots of other reasons. That's not so much the phosphorus in there. So that was a lot of information all at once, but the bottom line is that dietary phosphorus doesn't really matter when we're thinking about it directly, right? I don't need to make this more complicated than it needs to be, and focusing on reducing dietary phosphorus does not need to be a big focus for anyone with kidney stones, unless you have chronic kidney disease, then that's a completely different story. But if you do not have chronic kidney disease and you have normally functioning kidneys but have a history of kidney stones, we really don't need to be thinking about dietary phosphorus. I think there is a good chance that when we dive into your 24-hour urine test and we focus on fixing those things that are really driving your stone formation, which probably is going to be that high calcium, we sort of indirectly are going to lower your phosphorus intake potentially, but it's not really that phosphorus that's really driving that stone formation. It's really the fact that we are also reducing, again, those acid precursors, as well as added sodium, added sugar, those types of things, right? So hopefully this was helpful. Probably doesn't introduce a ton of new information to help you change your diet, but I think interesting, and if, hopefully, if nothing else, makes it a little bit easier if you have been worried about how much phosphorus you're eating and you have calcium phosphate kidney stones. Please know that this doesn't need to be a big focus. There's lots of other things that we need to do that we know will reduce your risk of calcium phosphate kidney stones. So, as always, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you found this episode helpful, and please, if you have a question that you would like me to tackle on a future episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast, I would love to hear from you. If you head to kidneystonespodcast.com, you can record your question for a chance to get answered. I always say that those listener questions are my favorite episodes to record because I know that I am answering questions that you guys for sure have. So please let me know if you have any questions. And with that, I will close this episode, and I hope to see you next Wednesday. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For more help with kidney stones, check out my website, www.thekidneydietitian.org. For more personalized help from me, check out my online course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. VIP enrollment includes help directly from me. I can't wait to see you there and help you prevent kidney stones. Have a great day.